Hey guys, tonight we wander into a world where a single bite could make you a social outcast, or worse, get you in trouble with the law of the gods. You probably won't survive this, but let's try anyway. Picture yourself walking through the dusty streets of ancient Egypt, the Nile glinting gold in the late afternoon sun, and suddenly a scent hits your nose. It's not the fragrant bread or roasted grains you're used to. No, it's the pig. A creature that for Egyptians was more than just unappetizing, it was downright forbidden. You step back instinctively, because eating pork here isn't just frowned upon, it could ruin your status, your reputation, maybe even your afterlife. Scholars still argue whether these prohibitions were purely health-related or steeped in social hierarchy, but what's undeniable is the grip these food rules held over daily life. Now imagine yourself at a bustling market in Thebes. Merchants are shouting over the clatter of carts, women are balancing baskets of dates and figs on their heads, and children dart between legs chasing after geese. Amid all this vibrancy, there's a clear, invisible boundary. Certain foods are off limits, taboo in ways that you, standing centuries later, might struggle to understand. Pork is one, but the list doesn't stop there. Certain birds, fish that swim too close to the Nile's muddy banks, and even some grains considered unclean are avoided by devout citizens. It's a complex web. These aren't just dietary choices, they are statements of faith, loyalty, and identity. When you eat what is forbidden, you aren't merely hungry, you're challenging an entire social order. As you wander further into the temple district, incense curling around massive stone columns, you notice scribes carefully recording offerings. A slab of meat placed incorrectly could offend the gods. Priests enforce these taboos with almost ritualistic seriousness. Scholars still debate whether the Egyptians understood the microbiology behind disease transmission or if it was all symbolic, a coded system of moral and social structure. Either way, the rules are strict. You can see it in the hierarchy of who prepares meals, who serves them, and who touches the forbidden ingredients. A commoner accidentally nibbling at a prohibited animal could face shame, fines, or even banishment from a local temple ritual. But food taboos weren't just about punishment, they were also about identity. You feel it when you pass through a household where the scent of roasting barley and figs wafts through open windows. The family inside is devout. They avoid what's forbidden not out of fear alone, but out of devotion. Scholars still argue whether adherence was more about spiritual purity or public performance. But from where you stand, both seem equally important. Food is more than sustenance here, it's a statement. By choosing what to consume or avoid, people declare their belonging to a culture, a religion, a political class. You realize that every bite carries weight, and every meal is a negotiation with invisible forces of society and faith. Your path now takes you through the bustling docks along the Nile. Traders from Nubia, Libya, and farther east unload exotic goods. Figs, dates, and grains arrive in abundance, but certain animals are never seen on the trading boats. Pigs? Rarely. Cats? Absolutely not, as they are sacred. The absence is as telling as the presence. Even outside temple rituals, you notice a tension between desire and restriction. You might long to taste something forbidden just to experience it, but you hesitate. The invisible laws linger in your mind, a quiet pressure you can't shake. Scholars still debate whether these prohibitions had health benefits, were entirely symbolic, or a mix of both. But standing here among the merchants and priests, it feels like a language you must speak fluently if you want to belong. And then there's the odd, quirky detail that makes you chuckle. The Egyptians sometimes used pigs in symbolic rituals, like in curses or magical acts, but never as food for themselves. The same creature that could carry divine weight in ritual could never grace their dining tables. It's almost like a cosmic inside joke. They revered it and feared it at the same time. You might even smirk imagining a tiny pig figurine sitting on a temple altar while the same animal is shunned in the home kitchen. Food taboos are funny, strange, and deeply serious all at once. By now, you're beginning to feel the real impact. These restrictions shaped entire neighborhoods, social interactions, and even political power. You notice that the wealthy have access to alternatives that the commoners do not. Certain grains, fish, or dairy products are exclusive to elites, while the forbidden items become markers of class and devotion. Eating what is forbidden isn't just a personal choice, it's a declaration. You can imagine scholars still arguing over whether a farmer accidentally eating a forbidden grain could disrupt the cosmic balance. But from your perspective, it's clear that food was an unspoken law book, a moral compass, and a social contract all rolled into one. Finally, you pause by the edge of the Nile, the water reflecting the deepening sunset. You taste the air, heavy with offerings, incense, and the faintest hint of forbidden meat, though only in thought. The lesson is already clear. In ancient civilizations, what you didn't eat was just as powerful as what you did. Every prohibition carried layers of meaning, social, political, spiritual, even economic. And as you watch the sun sink behind distant pylons, you can't help but feel a little thrill. You're wandering in a world where one bite could define your fate, and it's both terrifying and exhilarating. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander now across the dry, cracking earth, where the Ganges shimmers like liquid glass in the distance. The scent of incense, smoke, and ghee hangs heavy in the air. A cow passes by you slowly, her eyes calm, almost knowing, and people move aside as if royalty were walking through the street. You realize quickly, this isn't just any animal. Here in ancient India, the cow is more than a source of milk or labor. She is mother, provider, and symbol of life itself. You notice how no one raises their voice around her, how even the children lower their gaze in quiet reverence. It's the kind of respect most rulers can only dream of earning. You watch a farmer scoop grain into a bronze bowl, offering it to the cow before feeding his own family. There's a rhythm to this world, a ritual in every small act of eating, milking, or cooking. You can almost hear the quiet moral heartbeat behind it. To harm or consume the cow is to wound something sacred. Scholars still argue whether this reverence was born out of religious devotion or practical survival. After all, cows provided milk, dung for fuel, and labor for fields. But whatever the reason, the result was the same. They became untouchable in the truest sense. At a riverside village, smoke from cooking fires curls into the pink sky. You see women boiling lentils and rice, mixing them with herbs, never with meat. The absence of beef is as palpable as the aroma of spice itself. You can sense the discipline in every pot, every bite. It's not just about food, it's about balance. Eating is an act of faith. Scholars still argue whether ancient Indians viewed the cow as divine from the beginning or if the symbolism evolved as agriculture deepened. But either way, her presence redefined morality itself. There's a strange serenity in how this taboo shapes daily life. You watch a group of Brahmins, priests in white garments, chanting beside a temple adorned with carvings of cows and lotuses. Their prayers rise like the smoke of their offerings. You notice how every aspect of the meal, what's cooked, what's shared, what's left untouched, is bound by layers of ritual. It's almost bureaucratic in its precision. Certain foods are pure, others are polluting. You might even feel the tension in your own stomach. afraid to reach for the wrong bowl. Eating the forbidden here isn't just impolite, it's karmic sabotage. And then comes an odd, almost humorous moment. You hear a traveler whisper about a merchant from another land who dared to roast beef in secret. The story spreads like wildfire through the market. Some laugh nervously, others gasp in disbelief. The man vanishes from the town soon after. Maybe he left on his own. Maybe he was helped to leave. You'll never know. The cow's protection isn't just religious, it's social enforcement in action. Scholars still debate whether these incidents were exaggerated moral tales or real acts of punishment, but what's undeniable is the fear that kept the rule alive. You walk deeper into the countryside, where endless green fields stretch toward the horizon. You pass stone idols dusted with flowers, and small offerings of butter, grains, and milk laid gently before them. These people believe the universe itself is nourished by the cow's generosity. Every sip of milk feels like communion with something eternal. You begin to understand why eating beef wasn't just forbidden, it was unthinkable. To do so would be like burning your own home for warmth. It's that paradox of abundance and restraint, when survival depends on respect. One of the older villagers tells you in a cracked voice, "The cow is our mother." You nod politely, but he insists, not metaphorically, literally. She gives us everything we need. He gestures toward a field plowed by oxen, a child drinking warm milk, and a dung fire keeping the kitchen alive. You realize he's right. The universe itself turns on this relationship. It's not about worship, it's about balance. Scholars still argue whether this taboo had roots in resource preservation or divine reverence, but to those living it, the two were never separate. And yet, under this peaceful order, a quiet irony hums. You catch a whisper about a tribe in remote hills who eat beef secretly, claiming the gods don't watch beyond the temples. Some even argue that early Vedic rituals once involved cattle sacrifice before evolving into the reverence you see now. That idea unsettles you. Could this entire sacred system have emerged from guilt and reform? Scholars still debate that too. Maybe the holiness of the cow isn't about purity, it's about collective atonement, a vow never to repeat an ancient sin. You rest beneath a banyan tree, the air warm and heavy. The sound of distant bells mixes with the rhythmic chewing of a cow nearby. She looks at you, and you can't help but smile. You remember the pigs of Egypt, shunned and despised, and now this, an animal adored beyond measure. The contrast is startling. It's as if every civilization drew its moral compass from the dinner plate, each culture finding its own forbidden truth. By now, night has fallen. The village settles into silence, but the cows remain awake, wandering the dusty paths like silent guardians. You watch one nuzzle a child asleep by the doorway, her breath slow and gentle. You feel the soft pulse of devotion in the air. The forbidden, you realize, is not always about fear. It can also be about love. In India, that love grew so powerful, it rewrote the laws of faith and family, binding people to an animal that became both symbol and savior.
You drift now to the cradle of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia, where the air smells of wet clay, smoke, and baked bread. The Tigris and Euphrates glimmer under a hazy dawn, their waters nourishing a people who carved the first laws and recipes into clay tablets. You can almost hear the chatter of market women, the lowing of oxen, and the rhythmic slap of dough against stone ovens. This world thrives on food, but not all food is welcome. Here, even in the earliest cities, you find invisible lines dividing the acceptable from the forbidden. You step into a bustling street of Merchants display dates, barley cakes, and beer, always beer. The Mesopotamians loved their beer, thick as porridge and full of life. Yet, curiously, some foods are missing. You notice no pork, little raw fish, and no mention of certain wild animals. Scholars still argue whether these absences were deliberate taboos or simply regional scarcity. But you feel a deeper pattern beneath it all: control. In a land where gods oversaw every harvest, every meal carried divine weight. To eat wrongly was to insult not just society, but the gods themselves. You pass a small shrine where offerings of bread and oil rest before statues of Inanna and Enlil. The priests monitor every detail: what's given, what's burned, what's shared. You reach for a small loaf, and a priest sharply gestures for you to stop. Not for you, his eyes say. This food is reserved for gods, rulers, and the hierarchy that binds them. Food here defines class as surely as crowns or jewelry. You can't help but notice that what's forbidden to one group might be a privilege to another. Scholars still argue whether these divine feasts were genuine worship or clever political theater, but either way, it worked. It kept everyone in their place. Then comes the odd detail that makes you grin. Some cuneiform tablets list recipes so detailed they read like sacred instructions, complete with ingredients, measurements, and the order of cooking. But certain items, like specific fish or meats, are absent. You wonder if that was intentional censorship. Perhaps scribes weren't just writing about food, but controlling who could know it. Imagine recipes as state secrets, guarded like treasure. It's strangely modern: knowledge as power, flavor as hierarchy. You walk into a household courtyard where a woman stirs a pot of lentils. The aroma is rich and earthy, but she glances nervously toward her neighbor's window before adding a pinch of spice. "This is for my husband," she whispers. "He is of the priestly class." You realize even flavor itself carries boundaries. Ordinary people are forbidden from using certain combinations of herbs and oils reserved for temple kitchens. To copy a priest's meal could be seen as sacrilege. Scholars still debate whether this was superstition or a means of rationing valuable imports, but the effect is the same. Food divides. In the heart of Babylon, the contrast sharpens. The wealthy feast on lamb and onions. The poor subsist on barley gruel. Yet everyone, rich or poor, avoids one thing: raw meat. It's considered impure, a vessel for chaos. The law codes of Hammurabi even specify punishments for serving unfit food to superiors. Eating something forbidden here isn't just bad manners, it's a legal offense. You imagine standing before a judge, your crime written neatly in clay. He served rotten fish to a nobleman. The punishment? Maybe fines, maybe worse. Scholars still argue whether these rules were genuinely enforced or symbolic, but you can feel their weight pressing through centuries. Night falls and the air cools over the riverbanks. You watch fishermen drag their nets, sorting through their catch carefully. Certain fish, bottom feeders, eel-like creatures, are tossed back. The priests say they carry the taint of the underworld. The superstition feels familiar. It echoes the Egyptians' aversion to mudfish and the Hebrews' later rules about scale and fin. You sense a cultural thread weaving through time, humans fearing what lives too close to the dirt, too deep in the dark. Then a curious thing happens. You're invited to a communal feast. Clay bowls circle a low table. The host pours out beer, cloudy, warm, foamy, and raises his hands to the sky before drinking. Everyone follows in ritual unison. You take a sip, it's sour, thick, alive. The act isn't casual, it's covenantal. Sharing food here means sharing fate. Refusing a dish, even a forbidden one, could offend your host and the gods simultaneously. You realize that food taboos aren't only about restriction, they're about connection. They dictate not just what you avoid, but who you belong with. As you listen to the laughter and songs, you remember the pigs of Egypt and the cows of India. Each civilization defines itself by what it will not eat. Here in Mesopotamia, the forbidden often blends with the sacred. What the gods claim for themselves, mortals must leave untouched. It's a strange kind of reverence, built not on love or fear alone, but on the deep need to keep order in a chaotic world. By the time the feast ends, you're left with crumbs of barley bread and a quiet truth. The world's first civilizations didn't just invent writing, law, and architecture, they invented food politics. What began as offerings to gods became tools for kings, and what was once sacred became secret. You brush clay dust from your hands and glance toward the dark river, wondering how many forbidden meals were eaten in silence, how many boundaries quietly broken under the moonlight.
You open your eyes to sunlight glinting off marble. The air smells faintly of olives, roasted grain, and sea salt. You're standing in a bustling Greek agora, surrounded by merchants shouting prices and philosophers debating the nature of virtue over cups of watered wine. But beneath the chatter, you feel something familiar, those invisible lines of what's acceptable to eat and what isn't. Every stall sells something, but not everything is fair game. You've stepped into a world where even appetite has philosophy. A baker offers you a small loaf of barley bread, dense and coarse. You take it gratefully, but when you reach for a sausage from the next stall, a woman pulls your hand back. "Not on festival days," she warns. You glance at her confused. Meat, it turns out, is not a daily indulgence here. It's a ritual act. The Greeks saw meat eating as a bridge between gods and men, a serious, sacred event tied to sacrifice. To eat meat without offering first to the divine was to eat impiously. Scholars still argue whether this rule was religious prudence or a clever social control to keep the economy balanced, but you can feel the tension in every bite. You wander to a shaded colonnade where philosophers sit cross-legged, eating figs and nuts. One of them, perhaps a student of Pythagoras, looks up and smirks. "We eat no flesh," he declares proudly, "for the soul of man and beast are one." His companions nod in agreement. Vegetarianism here isn't a trend, it's a moral stance. They see meat as violence, a disruption of cosmic harmony. You chew your bread slowly, realizing that even in this land of reason, food taboos have found a new disguise: ethics. Scholars still debate whether Pythagoras himself truly forbade meat or if his later followers exaggerated the legend, but the myth alone is powerful enough to shape centuries of diets. Then there's the odd, quirky detail. Some Greeks believed beans contained trapped souls of the dead. You stare at a humble bowl of lentils, and suddenly it seems haunted. The story goes that during a political escape, Pythagoras refused to flee through a bean field, choosing death over desecration. Whether it happened or not, the taboo took root. You can't help but laugh softly. Of all the forbidden foods so far, pigs, cows, fish, this one feels strangely charming. Fear the bean, avoid the lentil, save your soul. Yet beneath the absurdity lies the same ancient truth. What you avoid defines who you are. You cross the sea now, sailing west toward Rome. The harbor smells sharper, heavier, like wine and sweat and ambition. The Romans had their own complicated relationship with food. Here, nothing is simply forbidden, but everything is stratified. The wealthy dine on delicacies from distant provinces: dormice stuffed with honey, flamingo tongues, and rare fish from the Nile. The poor make do with bread, olives, and maybe salted fish if luck permits. Yet even in this empire of indulgence, rules still linger. You hear whispers about the dangers of eating fish during certain moon cycles, of the shame in consuming what's meant for slaves. Food isn't just nourishment, it's performance. At a banquet, you recline among senators and poets.
Platters of roasted boar, seafood, and fruit glisten under oil lamps. Yet no one touches the fish sauce until the host signals. Timing, order, respect, all ritualized. A single misstep can mark you as uncultured, unworthy of your rank. Scholars still argue whether Roman dining etiquette grew from religion or pure elitism, but watching it unfold, you suspect both. The forbidden here is not the ingredient itself, it's the act of crossing the invisible line of propriety. And then comes a darker undertone. You overhear hushed talk of poisoning, an ever-present fear in Roman politics. To eat at another man's table could be a death sentence. Certain herbs, mushrooms, and seafood gain a reputation for danger, banned quietly among the cautious. Some even employ tasters, their lives reduced to the gamble of a single bite. The empire's most paranoid emperors avoided entire food groups, claiming divine intuition guided them. Scholars still debate whether these fears were justified or pure politics disguised as superstition. But as you sip your diluted wine, you can feel that fear sinking into your gut, too. Later, you stroll past a small temple to Ceres, goddess of grain. Offerings of wheat and fruit lie before her statue, untouched by human hands. A farmer bows deeply before leaving his basket. You realize the pattern repeating. From Egypt to India to Greece and Rome, what is offered to the divine is what becomes forbidden to mortals. It's a poetic symmetry. What has belonged to heaven cannot be eaten by man. Yet in Rome, the lines blur constantly. Religion and indulgence, purity and politics, they mix like wine and water. Night descends over the city, and the streets grow quieter. You find yourself at a tavern, surrounded by commoners sharing bowls of stew. A drunk man laughs and tears a chunk of bread, shouting, "The gods don't care what we eat." Everyone laughs, but you can sense the danger in the words. Somewhere, an unseen order still listens. You remember how in Egypt a forbidden meal could ruin your name, and here in Rome it could ruin your reputation or worse, your alliances. The tools of control have changed, but the hunger for order remains the same. You leave the tavern as dawn begins to blush over the rooftops. The marble glows soft and pale. You think of all the things you've seen so far. The pigs avoided, the cows worshipped, the beans feared, the feasts politicized. You realize that civilizations evolve, but the psychology behind food taboos never disappears. Every culture invents its own way to sanctify appetite and disguise control as devotion. And as you walk past the silent temples of the gods, you can't help but smile. The forbidden, it seems, always finds its way to the table, just in different flavors.
You step now into a land of dust, prophecy, and devotion, ancient Israel, where every meal feels like a quiet conversation with God. The sun burns low over the Judean hills, and in the distance you hear the murmur of prayers rising with the wind. You find yourself standing near a small clay hearth as a family prepares their evening meal. It's simple, bread, lentils, olives, but there's a careful choreography to it. No pork, no shellfish, no meat mixed with milk. Every choice, every flavor is deliberate. Here, food isn't just nourishment, it's covenant. The eldest in the family breaks the bread and whispers a blessing. You notice the reverence in their movements, how they separate cooking vessels, one for meat, another for dairy. Nothing touches that shouldn't. It's almost surgical in precision. You ask quietly, "Why?" The old man smiles. Because he commanded it. No further explanation needed. For them, the forbidden isn't superstition or preference, it's obedience. You realize this is where food and faith intertwine so tightly that they become indistinguishable. Scholars still argue whether these laws found in Leviticus and Deuteronomy began as spiritual hygiene or divine metaphor, but to the people living them, they are sacred truth. You wander through the market in Jerusalem, alive with noise and color. There are baskets of figs, jars of honey, slabs of fish glistening with salt. But the butcher's stalls are noticeably sparse. No pig's heads, no blood sausages, no mixture of meat and milk products. You overhear a merchant scolding an apprentice who splashes milk too close to a tray of meat. "You want to curse us all?" he snaps. You step back, startled by the seriousness of it. Scholars still argue whether these laws symbolized spiritual hygiene or divine metaphor. But either way, the intensity is unmistakable. Every ingredient, every vessel carries moral weight. You turn a corner and encounter a group of priests in white linen robes inspecting offerings. A farmer presents 2 doves and a small jar of grain. One priest nods approval, the other rejects a blemished lamb. You can feel the tension. A system built on perfection. It's not enough to eat what's permitted. It must also be pure, inspected, worthy. You start to see the broader picture. Food laws here are not just about holiness, they're about discipline. They train the people to live consciously, to remember every single day that they are different from the nations around them. And then comes the odd, almost unsettling detail. Even insects are cataloged in Scripture, some declared clean, others detestable. Locusts? Allowed. Beetles? Absolutely not. You glance around and wonder who would eat either. But in a desert where famine is familiar, every crumb counts. The law isn't arbitrary. It's a boundary against desperation. It's God saying, even in hunger, you will remember me. You shiver at the thought. Scholars still argue whether these distinctions carried symbolic meanings, purity through order, sin through chaos, but they agree on one thing. Few cultures ever turned diet into devotion as thoroughly as this one. You pause to rest near the temple steps, watching worshippers carry baskets of first fruits, grapes, barley, pomegranates, to offer. Each gift is weighed, inspected, and dedicated. None of it will be eaten by the offerer. It belongs to God. You recall Egypt, where the priests guarded temple food, and India, where the cow was sacred. The pattern continues. What belongs to the divine becomes forbidden to the common. But here in Jerusalem, the act feels deeply personal. It's not fear, it's remembrance. To eat rightly is to live rightly. To abstain is to stay in covenant. Then a voice from behind surprises you. A traveler, perhaps from Greece, muttering, "Strange people, afraid of their own food." You turn to answer, but stop yourself. Maybe he doesn't understand. To the outsider, it must seem excessive, but to these people, it's survival, not of the body, but of identity. Scholars still debate whether kosher laws were designed to preserve health or unity, but for a scattered nation surrounded by enemies, shared boundaries were the glue holding them together. The wind shifts and carries the scent of roasting lamb. Somewhere nearby, preparations for Passover are underway. You follow the smell, drawn to a courtyard where families gather, each with their own lamb, each household reenacting a story older than memory. "Eat quickly and remember where we came from," someone whispers. The lamb isn't just food, it's narrative. Every bite recalls slavery, freedom, faith. You realize that in this world, breaking a food law isn't merely disobedience, it's forgetting who you are. You watch as the stars rise above the desert, bright and unblinking. The forbidden foods list plays in your mind. Pork, shellfish, mixed fabrics of meal and milk, animals with cloven hooves or lacking fins and scales. They're not just rules, they're a rhythm, an identity, a defense against assimilation. You sense that the fear of contamination here isn't just about the body, it's about the soul. Before you leave, an elderly woman offers you a date and says softly, "Everything has meaning, even what we refuse." You take it, humbled. The sweetness lingers on your tongue long after she's gone. You think of how in every civilization the forbidden binds people together through love, fear, or faith. Here, it's all three at once. You walk into the night, the city glowing behind you like a lantern in the dark. The hum of prayers fades into the wind, but the weight of their rules remains. And you understand, maybe for the first time, that sometimes the things we cannot eat tell the most about who we truly are.
You step into ancient China, where the morning mist clings to the rice paddies like silk and the air hums with quiet discipline. The scent of soy, ginger, and smoke drifts from clay stoves. But beneath this harmony lies a web of unspoken prohibitions, centuries of belief, class, and custom, shaping what may or may not reach the table. You walk through a small Han village, watching women chop vegetables on smooth wooden boards, while an old man tends to a pot bubbling over an open flame. It smells divine, until someone whispers, "Not all meat brings fortune." Here, what you eat defines not just your health, but your soul, your family, even your luck. The pig is both beloved and sacred, yet its slaughter is timed to lunar omens. The dog, once a loyal guardian, now sits in the gray zone of taboo, eaten by some, reviled by others. And then there's the ultimate contradiction, the cow. In ancient times, cows were revered as laborers, the engines of the fields. To eat one wasn't merely gluttony, it was betrayal. Killing a cow was like burning your plow or shattering your rice bowl. You glance around the fields, watching farmers lead their oxen with care, whispering to them as if to kin. Scholars still argue whether this reverence grew from Buddhism's compassion or from economic necessity, but either way, it made the cow untouchable for most. As you wander deeper into a bustling town, you pass a small tea house. Men sit around tables playing Wei Qi, sipping from porcelain cups, gossiping about a nearby family shamed for selling dog meat. Bad luck, one says, tapping his teacup sharply. Their ancestors will curse them. You realize the taboo runs deeper than taste. It's about moral cleanliness, about keeping your spiritual ledger balanced. The ghosts of your ancestors are always watching, and they have opinions about your dinner. You follow the conversation as it drifts toward stranger meats. The locals talk of snakes eaten in southern regions, frogs boiled in rice wine, and a forbidden dish whispered only by name, human flesh. In times of famine, some chronicles claim, desperate villagers resorted to it. The records of the Grand Historian mention it in passing, and even now, historians squirm at the line between myth and survival. Scholars still argue whether these tales were warnings against chaos or true records of human hunger. Either way, they haunt the edges of China's culinary history like a shadow. But not all taboos are dark. Some are born from reverence. You're invited to a small Buddhist monastery nestled in the mountains. Inside, the monks move silently, cooking in harmony. No garlic, no onion, no meat. Strong flavors disturb the mind, one tells you, stirring a pot of tofu and mushrooms. We eat to live, not to awaken the body's desires. You taste the broth, it's gentle, earthy, surprisingly filling. In that moment, you understand this isn't denial, it's discipline. The forbidden foods here are not punishments, but paths toward peace. Still, the contrast across dynasties is dizzying. During the Tang, emperors dined on exotic meats, bear paws, leopard marrow, even peacock tongues, delicacies flaunting power. But by the Ming era, Confucian ethics softened the palate. To govern well, eat with restraint, they'd say. The emperor's table mirrored his virtue. You see the pattern. Food wasn't just a pleasure, it was a political statement. What you refused to eat spoke louder than what you served. Scholars still argue whether these imperial taboos were about health or moral theater, But one thing is certain, even gluttony in China had boundaries. You walk past a butcher's stall. Hanging from hooks are cuts of pork and duck, glistening with glaze. But there's a missing scent, the absence of beef. You ask, why no cow meat? The butcher laughs softly, because heaven lent them to us. They plow, they give. To kill one is to invite drought. His words settle, like incense smoke in your thoughts. You begin to see how Chinese taboos blend philosophy with practicality, morality with superstition. Food becomes a mirror of the cosmic order, heaven above, ancestors below, balance in between. Further south, in the humid provinces, another paradox emerges. The Cantonese are famous for eating everything with 4 legs except the table. But even here, taboo lingers in subtle ways. Certain meats are said to bring coldness or heat to the body, disrupting balance. Dog meat, once thought to warm the blood in winter, later becomes a social taboo as compassion rises in Buddhist influence. The same dish that once meant strength now means shame. You realize taboos evolve like languages. What was sacred once may later disgust. You stop by a scholar's home near Hangzhou. He invites you to share a meal of rice, vegetables, and pickled plum. On the wall behind him hangs a calligraphy scroll. Harmony at the table reflects harmony in the world. As he pours tea, he explains that true wisdom lies in restraint. To abstain, he says, is to respect the natural rhythm. Overindulgence breaks harmony, and heaven does not forgive imbalance. His words sound ancient, yet eerily modern. You sip your tea, feeling the lesson settle deep inside. Night falls over the bamboo groves. You sit by a lantern, thinking about everything you've seen. Farmers refusing to eat their oxen, monks rejecting onions, nobles hiding moral restraint behind silk curtains. The Chinese world of taboo isn't built on fear. It's woven from philosophy, belief, and centuries of observation. It whispers, food is medicine, morality, and fate. The breeze rustles the leaves above you, and for a moment you imagine Confucius himself sitting nearby, nodding in approval. You can almost hear his voice. When eating, be moderate. When choosing, be wise. In what you refuse, you find who you are. And as the moon climbs above the hills, you realize taboos aren't about denial. They're about control. In a world ruled by balance, even your hunger must bow to harmony.
You drift into Egypt, where the desert wind smells of dust and incense, and golden light spills over the Nile like melted amber. The air hums with prayers and the soft murmur of life tied to the river. You walk past date palms and reed huts toward a village feast. Bread bakes in clay ovens, beer ferments in jars, and fish dry on woven mats. It all seems ordinary until you notice who's not eating. The priest at the center table refuses fish, his head bowed in quiet defiance. Around him, people exchange glances. You can almost feel the tension rise, not out of fear of poison, but reverence. For in Egypt, food was never just food. It was divine negotiation. To eat something unclean was to insult the gods themselves. You find yourself listening to a woman whisper, "The Nile fish carry the soul of Osiris." Her tone is both fearful and proud. You realize that what you see as dinner, she sees as a moral choice. Some fish, especially from certain parts of the river, were forbidden for priests, while commoners could eat them freely. Scholars still argue whether this rule came from practical sanitation, the fish feeding on corpses after floods, or pure theology. Either way, it became a line between sacred and profane. You wander into a temple courtyard. There's a strange silence here, punctuated by the low hiss of burning oil. Offerings line the steps, honey cakes, onions, and loaves shaped like birds.
but no pig. Never a pig. In ancient Egypt, the pig was a walking taboo, tied to Seth, the god of chaos and storms. To eat it was to swallow disorder itself. Farmers still raised pigs, but even they knew to wash themselves before stepping into a temple. You imagine the irony, a creature raised for food, yet cursed by association. Scholars still argue whether the pig's exclusion was because of disease, ritual impurity, or its link to Seth's mythic rebellion. But the belief stuck, shaping Egyptian diets for thousands of years. And yet, despite the taboos, Egypt was obsessed with abundance. Tomb walls show painted banquets, roast ducks, beef joints, and overflowing wine jugs. The dead were fed as lavishly as the living. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was immortality in edible form. Each offering carried a promise, may your Ka never hunger. You look closer at the hieroglyphs and see depictions of priests reciting spells as they present food to the dead. Even the forbidden had its place here. It was the absence that mattered. The gods were fed perfection, never corruption. As you wander through a market in Memphis, your senses are overwhelmed. Vendors shout, children dart between stalls, and the air smells of coriander and sweat. But look closely. Not every food is available to everyone. Certain cuts of meat, like the hindquarters of cattle, are reserved for the elite. Honey and figs are luxuries, and beneath the surface, quiet hierarchies of taste reveal social rank. Eat what the nobles eat, someone jokes, and you'll anger the gods and the tax collector. You realize that food here is a mirror of power. Taboo isn't always divine, sometimes it's political. A scribe invites you into his modest home. He offers you lentils and beer, apologizing for the simplicity. The priests, he says, they say onions make the breath impure, but the workers, they say onions give strength. You chew thoughtfully. The flavor is sharp, grounding. There's something poetic in how one man's impurity becomes another's survival. Egypt's food taboos weren't just about holiness, they were about control. Who got to eat what reflected their place in the order of Ma'at, the balance that governed all things. At sunset, you find yourself near a festival by the river. Drums echo, dancers whirl, and the air smells of roasted goose. A priest chants beside a statue of Hathor, goddess of love and fertility, and women offer her pomegranates and beer. No pork, no fish, just sweet fruit and fermented grain. The offerings symbolized purity and fertility, not indulgence. You realize these people weren't denying themselves, they were aligning their appetites with the rhythm of the gods. Then, someone brings you a small clay tablet, a list of temple rules. One line stands out. Let no one eat what the gods forbid, for the mouth is the gate of the soul. You picture how every bite, every sip, was an act of worship or rebellion. Food wasn't random, it was ritual, woven into the moral fabric of life. You wander away from the noise, standing by the Nile under a moon that gleams like silver glass. The water carries whispers of ancient banquets and silent fasts. Somewhere, a crocodile slips beneath the surface, another creature once fed, feared, and worshipped. Egypt's taboos weren't about logic. They were about reverence. To refuse certain foods wasn't weakness. It was cosmic obedience. As you stare into the water's reflection, you can almost hear the voice of an ancient priest. The gods taste through us. What we eat, they remember. And you wonder, if your dinner defines your devotion, how many gods would you offend by breakfast?
You step into a world where power is plated in gold and served on silver trays. The air in the royal kitchen is heavy with spice and smoke. Servants rush through corridors carrying trays of figs, honeyed wine, and roasted quail. Outside, the common people gnaw on barley bread and onion stew, unaware that just a few hundred meters away, the king dines like a god. You wander past marble pillars and the scent of saffron greets you, a fragrance so rare it might as well be currency. You realize quickly that in ancient civilizations, the greatest taboos weren't about gods or purity, they were about privilege. You find yourself in the throne room of a Mesopotamian palace, watching scribes record the day's rations. There's an order written in cuneiform, one that forbids anyone but the king from eating a specific kind of honey cake. The reason? The flavor belongs to divinity. You can't help but smirk. Somewhere between reverence and ego, kings turned cuisine into worship. What you couldn't eat wasn't just about faith. It was about reminding you that you weren't divine. You picture the royal feasts of Egypt again, where even nobles waited for the pharaoh to take his first bite before daring to lift a spoon. The symbolism ran deep. The king's stomach was sacred, his digestion a metaphor for cosmic harmony. To eat what he ate without permission could invite death. And yet, beneath the grand myth, you sense a simpler truth. Food was control. What better way to keep the people loyal than to make the table itself a boundary line? Scholars still argue whether these royal food bans were rooted in religion or politics, but it's clear that appetite became a hierarchy. As you drift through time, you find yourself in ancient China's Forbidden City, surrounded by lacquered dishes and the scent of steamed duck. A eunuch whispers, "The emperor's rice is grown only in the dragon fields. No one else dares touch it." Even the water boiled for him comes from a separate well, purified by prayer. A single grain consumed without permission could mean execution. You realize this obsession with exclusivity wasn't just decadence, it was theater. The emperor didn't just rule the empire, he embodied it. His meals were state rituals, and his forbidden foods were political barriers dressed as divine ones. Further west, in the courts of Persia, the pattern repeats. You see silver platters of pomegranates, saffron lamb, and rare dates from Bactria. Yet the king alone drinks a perfumed wine called Shiraz el-Ruh, wine of the soul. The commoners aren't even allowed to know the recipe. You imagine the thrill and terror of tasting something no one else could. To eat like a god was to risk becoming one's enemy. In ancient Greece, luxury was equally complicated. The philosopher Plato dined modestly, preaching balance, but tyrants like Dionysius feasted so extravagantly that poets mocked them. Some foods, like certain fish or sweet syrups, became symbols of corruption, eaten only by those too rich for virtue. "He eats like a king," people would sneer, not as praise, but as insult. You realize how quickly the forbidden turns from holy to hollow. The higher one rose, the more their appetite became spectacle. But in Rome, exclusivity reached theatrical levels. You stand in a marble atrium as servants carry trays of flamingo tongues, sea urchins, and dormice stuffed with honey. These weren't forbidden by gods, they were forbidden by price. The emperor's feasts were performances of power. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens survived on grain rations. To eat what the emperor ate was treasonous extravagance. Scholars still argue whether these culinary excesses were moral warnings or propaganda tools, but either way, the message was clear. Food could crown or condemn you. You wander into a quieter moment and imagine dinner in medieval Europe. A monk records in his journal that no one outside the royal family may eat swan. The reason? Swans were symbols of purity and grace, the property of the crown. Killing one without permission was a crime against majesty itself. You imagine a starving peasant staring at a gliding swan on a lake, forbidden to touch it, even as hunger gnaws. It's cruel, poetic, and deeply human. The forbidden becomes a mirror for desire, proof that what's untouchable holds the most allure. As the centuries roll by, you notice a pattern forming like ripples on water. Every civilization had its own forbidden fruits, not always literal fruit, but luxury itself. What was divine to some was decadent to others. The Egyptian pharaoh's honey, the Chinese emperor's rice, the Persian king's wine, all symbols that drew a line between the chosen and the rest. You realize how privilege can dress itself as purity, how the elite's appetite becomes a moral compass for society. You picture yourself standing before a table laid for a god king. The torches flicker, the silver shines, and the food is almost too beautiful to touch. Around you, silence reigns. You're offered a single grape, plucked from the emperor's bowl. To accept it is to break taboo. To refuse it is to deny grace. You hesitate. The grape glows in the light, temptation incarnate. Then you hear a whisper, a servant's voice. It's not the food that's forbidden. It's the equality it implies. You let the grape fall. The sound is small, almost a confession. In that moment, you understand royal taboos weren't about taste. They were about distance. To keep a king, his hunger had to be sacred. As the night deepens, you step away from the banquet, your stomach hollow, but your mind full. Across millennia, food has fed not just bodies, but hierarchies. You think of the forbidden fruits of Eden, of king's honey and peasant's bread, and you realize the oldest taboo of all is envy itself.
You step into a dimly lit chamber where the air itself feels suspicious. Bowls of bright red powder, bundles of cinnamon sticks, and small glass bottles line a wooden table. The scent is intoxicating, sweet, sharp, exotic. But beneath it lingers something darker. In ancient times, spices were more than flavor. They were magic, medicine, and sometimes murder. You watch as a servant hesitates before sprinkling saffron into the king's stew. One pinch too much, and suspicion could mean death. You wander through the markets of Alexandria. Merchants shout over the din, promising cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, and cardamom worth its weight in silver. You can almost taste the heat in the air. But even here, among the chatter and color, paranoia simmers. The spices come from faraway lands, carried by sailors who speak strange tongues. To the people, they seem almost supernatural, too fragrant, too powerful. Some believe they're gifts from the gods. Others whisper they're tools of demons. You hear one merchant laugh nervously. A spice can heal your heart, or stop it. You follow that line into history's kitchens. In Rome, noble women guarded spice chests with keys hung around their necks. Saffron, cumin, and pepper were locked away like treasure. Not because of scarcity alone, but fear. There were rumors that enemies could lace them with toxins, slow-acting powders that killed days later. You imagine a dinner party where everyone smiles, sipping wine, while each guest wonders if the cinnamon on their fig cake hides a fatal secret. Scholars still argue whether ancient rulers were truly poisoned or just paranoid, but either way, fear became flavorless power. And yet, people couldn't resist. The more dangerous a spice seemed, the more valuable it became. In medieval Europe, nutmeg was worth its weight in gold, and owning it marked you as elite. But its potency scared many. Rumors spread that a single nutmeg could induce madness or death if consumed wrong. Apothecaries handled it like arsenic, measuring grains by candlelight. You can almost see them trembling, half alchemists, half doctors, trying to balance miracle and mayhem in their hands. You drift east into a Persian apothecary, where glass jars glisten in the lamplight. The scholar behind the counter explains that each spice has dual souls, one to heal, one to harm. Clove warms the blood, but too much burns the heart. His tone is reverent, almost fearful. You realize ancient medicine blurred the line between cure and curse. To forbid a spice wasn't ignorance.
It was caution against its hidden edge. The same powder that cured fever could end a dynasty. But poison wasn't always accidental. You find yourself at a royal feast in Athens. The philosopher sitting beside you leans close, whispering about Socrates' cup. The story is legend now, but here, in this smoky room, it feels fresh. Hemlock, the plant that silenced a mind too questioning. You shiver, realizing that food and death often shared the same table. The Greeks believed certain herbs held divine energy, and using them against someone was more than murder. It was sacrilege. Still, that didn't stop political rivals from seasoning betrayal into their meals. As you wander further, you come across an Egyptian scroll, faintly inked with recipes, not for food, but for vengeance. Powdered copper, arsenic, crushed lotus seeds. Mixed just right, they could kill a man without leaving a trace. The priests who read the stars also read recipes like these, turning kitchens into quiet battlegrounds. It's unsettling how trust, even in nourishment, became a gamble. In China, the fear evolved into ritual. The emperor's taster stood between dynasty and disaster, sampling every dish before it reached the throne. His reward for a job well done? Living through dinner. You can picture him swallowing cautiously, eyes darting to the emperor's face for reassurance. Still breathing, he must have thought. For now. Scholars still argue whether ancient rulers were truly poisoned or just paranoid, but either way, the precautions reveal something universal. Power is fragile, and every meal is an act of faith. And then there's the irony. Spices meant to preserve food often preserved fear instead. You see a Roman matron sprinkling pepper on salted fish, muttering a prayer to avert evil spirits. Pepper was thought to ward off corruption, not just in meat, but in the soul. Somewhere along the way, taste became superstition. You can't help but think, maybe that's still true. As centuries roll on, spices become symbols of status and suspicion alike. In medieval Europe, only nobles could afford certain imports, and using them without permission was seen as theft or blasphemy. Imagine being punished not for murder or treason, but for seasoning too richly. A kitchen rebellion executed on a plate. The forbidden flavors of the world became a silent language of class. Sweet for the rich, bland for the poor. You find yourself finally in a dimly lit room watching a queen stare at her wine. The chalice trembles slightly in her hand. Everyone's smiling, but no one's drinking. You realize the poisoner's true genius wasn't chemistry, it was suggestion. Fear itself became the most potent toxin. As the queen finally takes a sip, your breath catches. Nothing happens. Not tonight, at least. But you understand the lesson ancient civilizations learned and never forgot. Taste too deeply, and knowledge becomes dangerous. Because sometimes what kills you isn't in the food. It's in the trust you place before you eat it.
You find yourself in a candlelit monastery high on a hill, the wind whispering through stone corridors. The scent of incense mingles with boiled barley and herbs. A bell tolls softly, calling monks to the evening meal. But there's a curious rhythm here, periods of restraint followed by abundance. Today, fasting. Tomorrow, feast. You realize that in many ancient civilizations, control over food wasn't only about taboos, it was about timing. What you eat and when defines not just your body, but your obedience. You watch as a novice monk sits cross-legged, eyes closed, sipping a small cup of thin broth. His stomach rumbles, but he does not falter. Hunger teaches clarity, a senior monk whispers. Fasting here isn't punishment, it's a tool. It shapes mind, soul, and spirit. Scholars still debate whether these practices originated for spiritual insight, practical conservation, or both, but you feel the effect as if it were your own stomach being trained in silent discipline. Down in Babylon, centuries earlier, you see a similar pattern. Citizens abstain from meat during religious festivals, consuming only bread and beer. Their rulers control the schedule. Feast when the gods smile, abstain when the cosmos frowns. To eat outside these windows is impiety, a public challenge to authority. You feel the social pressure, how hunger itself becomes a leash, shaping loyalty and submission. The same rhythm repeats in India during the sacred lunar fasts, where even water is measured and carefully sipped. The body becomes a clockwork instrument, tuned to divine or royal commands. In Greece, fasting is philosophical. You watch a student of Pythagoras carefully refuse beans at dinner. The fast is moral, an exercise in virtue. The feast that follows is minimal, reinforcing discipline and self-control. You can almost hear the echo of his teacher. To govern desire is to govern life itself. Scholars still argue whether these restrictions were truly about piety, or if they were tools to signal status. But either way, the effect is unmistakable. The table becomes a stage for demonstrating moral superiority. You drift to Rome, where the contrast is extreme. Senators gorge themselves in glittering atriums, yet the common people endure religious fasts dictated by the calendar. Public feasts are staged to impress, reminding citizens that abundance belongs to the elite. Hunger, shame, and indulgence become intertwined with politics. You see the underlying principle. Controlling food is controlling society. By orchestrating fasts and feasts, rulers manipulate both stomachs and minds. Even in medieval Europe, monasteries balance strict abstinence with celebratory banquets. The monks' schedules are meticulous. Fast on certain days, feast on others, the timing following religious authority. You notice how these cycles instill patience, obedience, and hierarchy. Ordinary people watch and mimic, learning that restraint is virtuous, indulgence sanctioned only by social or divine decree. Scholars still debate whether fasting primarily served spiritual purposes or practical ones, food conservation, preparation for labor, but the symbolism remains powerful. You follow a festival in Egypt. Priests declare certain days sacred. Certain foods are reserved, others forbidden. On these feast days, the rich eat lamb and sweet beer, while the poor receive portions of barley bread. The feast reinforces the social order, teaching gratitude and hierarchy in one shared act. The same duality exists in India. Fasting teaches discipline, feasting celebrates obedience and social unity. You begin to see the invisible threads connecting civilizations across continents. In Japan, Buddhist monks practice sesshin, intense periods of fasting interwoven with ritual meals. You observe the monks moving silently, eating small portions with deep mindfulness. The fast heightens awareness. The meal becomes profound. You wonder if similar patterns shaped ancient China, Greece, and Rome. Hunger teaching humans about patience, obedience, and morality, binding them to social and divine law alike.
You step into a dim, smoky tavern somewhere between Mesopotamia and Greece, where the smell of fermented grains hangs heavy and the clink of clay cups punctuates conversation. Around you, the locals drink barley beer, watered wine, and fermented honey mead. Yet even here you sense invisible boundaries. Not all liquids are equal. Some are sacred, some taboo, and others downright dangerous. In ancient civilizations, what you drank could elevate your status, curse your soul, or mark you for death. You pick up a small cup of wine, tasting its sharp tang. Nearby, a priest frowns. Not now, he warns. Certain libations were forbidden to mortals except during ritual. The Greeks, for example, reserved wine mixed with specific herbs for ceremonial use. To drink it casually was considered disrespectful to Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy. Scholars still argue whether this restriction was spiritual or practical, given that some mixtures could be hallucinogenic, but to the believer, it was sacred. You take a cautious sip and feel the weight of history pressing against your tongue. Further east, in ancient India, you watch a yogi sip water from a sacred river. Not just any water, the Ganges itself. Ordinary drinking water is mundane, but the divine stream carries purification. Consuming it outside ritual or without respect is forbidden. Even milk and fermented drinks have rules. Some are acceptable only after certain prayers or offerings. You feel the delicate balance between sustenance and sin. The liquids themselves become conveyors of morality. In Egypt, beer is everywhere, but not for everyone. Commoners sip freely, but temple priests observe strict rules about how and when they can imbibe. Wine, reserved for the elite, often carries mystical properties. Drinking it unprepared could incur the god's wrath. You watch a scribe carefully measuring his portion, aware that a single misstep could disqualify him from ritual duties. Scholars still debate whether these rules were practical, preventing drunken errors in sacred spaces, or purely religious, but either way, they reinforce the sacred hierarchy. And then comes the odd, almost whimsical detail: certain drinks are forbidden seasonally. In China, consuming fermented rice wine in winter was thought to invite illness, while in summer, some herbal concoctions were avoided lest they disrupt the balance of hot and cold in the body. To the uninitiated, it may seem superstition, but you notice the logic in a land attuned to nature's rhythms. Drinking, like eating, becomes a measure of compliance with cosmic order. You drift into Rome, where wine flows freely, yet rules persist. Excess is a sin, and moderation is politically enforced. Poison is never far from mind. Emperors employ tasters to prevent assassination, while guests fear who might lace a cup with hemlock. Scholars still debate whether the paranoia was justified or theatrical, but either way, the taboo against unverified drinks is palpable. Drinking becomes performance, trust, and ritual intertwined. Meanwhile, in the Near East, palm wine is forbidden for children and certain castes, while priests sip it during sacred rites. You watch as an initiate hesitates, a bead of sweat tracing his temple. One sip too soon and he risks spiritual contamination. The liquids themselves become moral arbiters. What you drink signals your role, your piety, and your obedience. Even today, you realize, some of that caution survives in rituals and ceremonial toasts. You notice the odd detail that some civilizations banned intoxicants entirely for certain groups. Ancient Israelites forbade priests from wine before entering the sanctuary, emphasizing clarity of mind. Scholars still argue whether this was about divine service, practical restraint, or both, but you feel the meticulous care of generations weighing on every drop. Then you wander toward a more decadent scene, the courts of Persia. Here, rare wines infused with saffron and exotic herbs are served only to royalty. Servants ensure that no commoner tastes a drop. The king's cup is symbolic, a reminder that privilege and danger share the same vessel. One wrong sip could signify rebellion or disrespect, a lesson in hierarchy poured directly into the mouth. Finally, you stand by a quiet stream, the moon reflecting off the ripples. You dip a hand in, imagining the water as ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Indians once did. Even something as simple as water carries meaning,
rules, and ritual. Drinking, like eating, is never neutral. It shapes morality, status, and belief. You take a slow sip and feel history run down your throat. Every civilization whispers the same lesson. Some spirits are divine, some forbidden, and all demand respect. As the night deepens, you leave the tavern, your lips tingling from flavors both sweet and sharp. You realize that in ancient times, the danger wasn't just what you ate, it was what you drank, and the invisible hand of authority guided every swallow.
You find yourself on the muddy banks of a river that snakes through ancient lands, water glinting silver in the late afternoon sun. Fishermen haul nets heavy with wriggling fish, while children play along the shore, laughing and splashing. But even in this lively scene, invisible rules govern what may be caught, cooked, or eaten. Some fish are sacred, some poisonous, and others forbidden for reasons that are practical, spiritual, or somewhere in between. In Mesopotamia, you watch a priest inspect a catch before it even touches the cooking pot. Catfish, tilapia, and perch are fine for ordinary meals, but some species, like the dreaded spiny eel, are strictly avoided. It's said their sharp fins and mysterious nocturnal habits link them to chaos and misfortune. You feel the tension. Fishermen tread carefully, knowing that a single misstep could insult the gods. Scholars still argue whether these bans were primarily religious or a precaution against disease, but in either case, the boundaries are enforced with care and reverence. You drift along the Nile, watching Egyptian fishers drag nets through papyrus-strewn waters. Some fish are taboo for temple priests, their fins and scales considered unclean. You notice an old man casting a line into the deeper channel, muttering a prayer. He avoids catfish, which carry associations with Seth, the god of chaos. Scholars debate whether the taboo emerged from superstition or practical sanitation. The river could harbor parasites. But regardless, the taboo shaped what ended up on the banquet tables of both mortals and gods. In India, riverine taboos are intertwined with religion. Certain fish and crustaceans are forbidden to Hindus, particularly in regions where the Ganges is sacred. Eating from the holy river without ritual purification risks spiritual contamination. You see villagers washing each fish meticulously, chanting quietly as they prepare meals. Even the timing matters. Certain days of the week or lunar cycles restrict consumption. You realize the river itself dictates behavior. It is alive with rules, not just water. Ancient China presents a different logic. In some regions, freshwater fish are considered yin, cooling and potentially weakening if eaten excessively, while saltwater species are yang, strengthening the body and spirit. You watch a scholar measuring portions of carp, ensuring the balance aligns with traditional medicine. Scholars still debate whether these restrictions were symbolic or medicinal, but the meticulousness is clear. The wrong fish in the wrong season could upset both health and cosmic harmony. You wander into Greece, where seafood is both common and cautionary. Oysters, shellfish, and certain mollusks are often avoided, linked to the humors of the body. Physicians warn against eating them for fear of sickness, while religious festivals occasionally forbid the consumption of particular riverine creatures as offerings are made to Poseidon. You note the odd detail. Greeks believe some fish could absorb moral qualities, making them unfit for pious citizens. To eat recklessly was more than gluttony. It was potential corruption of the soul. Rome amplifies the complexity. Market stalls overflow with fish, but emperors and aristocrats control the rarest species. Salted fish from the Mediterranean might be common fare, but some delicacies, like lamprey or exotic river trout, are reserved for the elite. Ordinary citizens are warned against overindulgence. It might bring illness, scandal, or even social disfavor. Scholars still debate whether the elite's exclusive consumption of certain seafood was a symbol of status or merely a reflection of availability, but either way, forbidden fish convey a message. Not all water yields equal permission. In Africa, along the Niger and Congo rivers, taboos blend survival and spirituality.
Certain catfish or eels are avoided because they're believed to carry spirits of ancestors or misfortune. Fishermen sing to appease river spirits before casting nets, acknowledging that the right fish will nourish, the wrong fish might curse. You sense a harmony between practical caution and spiritual belief, ancient taboos functioning as both risk management and moral compass. And then you notice the universal thread. Across continents, civilizations fear what lives beneath the water. Whether because of gods, disease, or danger, rivers and seas impose invisible boundaries. Eating forbidden seafood is never a simple act. It carries consequences, visible and invisible. As dusk falls, you stand by the riverbank watching the water shimmer under the last rays of sun. The fish leap and splash, oblivious to human rules, yet humans live under their shadows. You realize that rivers, like societies, demand respect. To ignore their taboos is to court chaos. You take a slow breath, tasting the air thick with water and history. Understanding at last, the forbidden in the water teaches caution, discipline, and reverence, just as surely as any priest or king.
You stand in the middle of an ancient field, golden stalks of wheat swaying in a dry breeze. The scent of earth and grain fills the air, and you can almost taste the bread these crops will become. But not all grain is equal, and not every harvest is meant for human hands. For ancient civilizations, the boundary between sacred and profane food often began in the soil itself. Some grains were gifts from the gods, others were forbidden, cursed, or reserved for rituals so secret that even whispering their recipes could bring punishment. You reach down and brush your fingers against the wheat heads. The first harvest, in many cultures, was untouchable. In Sumer and Babylon, that inaugural bundle belonged to the gods. To eat it was sacrilege. Priests would offer it as a burnt sacrifice to Enlil, the god of the wind and earth, thanking him for his favor. Only after this divine transaction could ordinary people begin to grind their grain. Scholars still argue whether this restriction was purely spiritual or an early form of taxation cloaked in faith. But you feel how it bound the people to power just as firmly as the stalks tied in their bundles. In ancient Egypt, barley and emmer wheat were the foundation of daily life, yet there too restrictions bloomed like weeds in fertile soil. Certain grains could not be harvested on unlucky days or under specific stars. Priests watched the skies, and the rhythm of the cosmos dictated when scythes could swing. One misplaced day could doom an entire season's crop, or so they believed. Oddly enough, modern astronomers and agricultural historians admit that many of those taboos matched favorable weather patterns. It seems the ancients had wrapped early science in layers of divine command. You wander into ancient Greece, where Demeter, the goddess of harvest, demands purity from those who tend her fields. Her followers, especially the initiates of the Eleusinian mysteries, follow dietary codes forbidding certain grains and legumes during sacred periods. One odd detail lingers in your mind. Before initiation, participants fasted from barley water, a drink otherwise common in everyday life. Scholars still debate why, but perhaps abstaining heightened the spiritual impact of the rituals, or perhaps it reminded initiates that food and faith are inseparable. Then Rome takes the idea and politicizes it. Grain becomes currency, and control over it is control over people. The state enforces rules about who receives rations and when. During certain festivals, the plebeians are given bread,
but at others certain types of wheat are forbidden to the poor, reserved for nobility. A silent hierarchy exists within the flour itself. You can almost hear the whispers, the bread of kings, the crust of slaves. Food laws turn into social boundaries, each loaf a quiet declaration of who belongs and who does not. In ancient China, the 5 sacred grains, rice, millet, barley, wheat, and beans, form the core of civilization. But not all are meant for all people. The emperor alone may partake of certain combinations symbolizing harmony between heaven and earth. Peasants must respect cycles of abstinence tied to lunar phases. You imagine the imperial court, each meal dictated by cosmic alignment. Scholars still argue whether these grain rules were nutrition-based or cosmological, but either way, they reinforced a single truth. Food mirrored order, and breaking that order was rebellion. You drift farther north to the Celtic lands, where forbidden harvests take on a mystical flavor. In some communities, the first sheaf of grain isn't eaten but buried, to ensure fertility for next year's crop. Others burn it in bonfires, believing it carries the spirit of the field. You can feel the eerie beauty of the ritual, the mix of gratitude and fear. Even the soil seems alive, watching, waiting for respect. Then there are darker taboos. In famine years, when grain ran out, people were forbidden to eat seed grain, the portions saved for planting next season. Doing so was considered both desperate and sinful, an act of short-sighted destruction. Yet you can picture the hungry faces torn between survival and taboo. Scholars still debate whether these restrictions arose from religious belief or early agricultural wisdom. But either way, the lesson endures. Consume too greedily, and you destroy your own future. Odd little details emerge. In some African and South American cultures, women on their menstrual cycle were forbidden to touch stored grain, believed to sap its vitality. In others, grain was kept away from funerals, lest the spirit of the dead infect the coming harvest. These taboos, as strange as they sound, weave a common thread. You see how every society connected grain to life, fertility, and mortality itself. The simplest seed became sacred, a microcosm of existence. As you wander through these fields of time, the rhythmic whisper of wind against grain begins to sound like breath, like the slow exhalation of history itself. You realize that these forbidden harvests weren't merely about superstition. They were systems, ways to preserve balance, control abundance, and remind humanity of its dependence on the earth. When you look again, the field is empty. The wind has stilled. A single stalk stands uncut, bending slightly as if bowing to unseen gods. You reach for it, but stop halfway. Maybe some things are meant to stay untouched. Maybe every civilization needs its own sacred grain, the one that reminds it to pause before taking too much. You let your hand fall back to your side, feeling both hunger and humility in equal measure.
You walk through a bustling ancient market, 1,000 scents twirling through the air, spices, bread, roasting meat, and the sharp tang of fermenting wine. Traders shout in a dozen languages, and every stall offers something different. Yet beneath the chaos, invisible rules still whisper. What's sold, who buys it, and who dares to eat it. you begin to notice how forbidden foods didn't just limit diets, they sculpted entire cultures. Each restriction, each sacred meal, each culinary boundary became a mirror reflecting belief, identity, and power. You stop at a Roman food stall, where a baker proudly offers honey cakes, shaped like tiny gods. They're made with the pure grain reserved for the upper class, and only citizens of status can buy them. Behind the baker, a slave works with coarser flour to make dark, plain loaves for the poor. The difference isn't just taste, it's hierarchy you can chew. Scholars still argue whether these distinctions were about availability or ideology, but to you, it's clear. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was language. Eating the wrong bread could make you a social outcast, a culinary foreigner in your own city. You turn a corner and find yourself in an Indian village where a festival is in full swing. The aroma of clarified butter and rice pudding fills the air. But not everyone is invited to eat. The Brahmins sit apart, their meals sanctified through ritual, while others dine on humbler offerings. Each dish tells a story of purity, karma, and cosmic order. One odd detail catches your attention. Even the direction a person faces while eating matters. North for divine blessing, south for ancestral connection. These small gestures encode vast systems of faith. You see how forbidden foods, far from dividing, also unify. They remind everyone where they belong in the great chain of being. Further east, you drift into China's imperial kitchens. The clatter of bronze vessels echoes as cooks prepare elaborate dishes guided by yin and yang. Hot and cold, dry and moist, every ingredient chosen to balance the body and the universe. Certain meats are avoided during mourning. Others are required during festivals. Scholars still debate whether this structure arose from philosophy or practical observation, but the result is undeniable. A cuisine that teaches harmony, morality, and restraint through taste. You pause in Greece, where a feast is unfolding in honor of Demeter. Tables overflow with olives, figs, and roasted grains. But no fish, no beans. Those are forbidden tonight, symbols of impurity in this ritual. The act of omission itself becomes sacred. By not eating, they are feeding the gods. You realize how much of culture thrives not on indulgence, but on abstinence, on the quiet art of saying no. Across the sea in Egypt, you watch a high priest bless a meal before Pharaoh. The forbidden foods of commoners, pork, certain fish, are absent, replaced by honey, dates, and wine. Food becomes a direct communication with divinity, each dish an offering as much as a pleasure. And then you notice something small but striking. Servants taste every bite before Pharaoh does, both to check for poison and to share in his sacred power. Eating becomes ritual, hierarchy, and devotion rolled into one. Even in distant northern lands, you find echoes of the same truth. Celtic druids oversee harvest feasts where only specific grains are allowed. To eat otherwise would disrupt harmony with the natural world. The forbidden foods protect a spiritual ecosystem, keeping people in rhythm with seasons and soil. And when the meal ends, they bury a portion of the food as tribute to unseen forces, an ancient thank you whispered through the earth. An odd detail draws your attention. In several ancient societies, music and dining intertwined. Certain instruments, like the lyre in Greece or the lute in Persia, were banned during meals considered solemn or sacred. Silence itself was a dietary rule. Scholars still argue whether this was superstition or symbolism, but you can almost feel the stillness. Each bite measured, each swallow part of something larger than hunger. Over centuries, these taboos wove themselves into art, language, and politics. Forbidden foods inspired stories of temptation and virtue, sin and purity. Myths of the apple in Eden, the ambrosia of gods, the bread of life, all echo the same underlying tension, the power of what must not be eaten. You sense that human culture itself, from religion to literature, has been fermented in that forbidden barrel. Even today, echoes survive. Kosher, halal, vegetarianism, fasting, all modern descendants of ancient rules. You can trace the lineage straight back through millennia. These traditions shape community, guide morality, and offer comfort through continuity. A Muslim abstaining from pork, a Hindu avoiding beef, a Catholic fasting during Lent, all share a whisper from the same ancient voice. What you eat defines who you are. As you stroll back through the market, the sun sets and the smells soften into memory. You realize that every spice jar, every loaf, every grain of rice carries a fragment of history. The forbidden foods of the past haven't disappeared, they've evolved, hidden in rituals and customs that still feed billions. You smile softly at the thought. Humans never truly stop being shaped by their meals. The difference between sacred and sinful, allowed and forbidden, still flavors every culture. You pause at the edge of the market and look around one last time. The laughter, the barter, the smells all fade into a warm hum. You understand now that food isn't just survival or pleasure. It's identity, law, and memory combined. And in every civilization, ancient or modern, the forbidden plate tells the truest story of who we really are. You find yourself walking through a quiet museum just before closing time. The last visitors have gone, the echo of footsteps fading down marble holes. Glass cases shimmer under soft light, ancient bowls, fragments of clay tablets, faded paintings of feasts and rituals. You stand still, feeling the silence around you hum with something familiar. Every civilization here left behind more than art or weapons. They left recipes, rules, and warnings. You realize that their forbidden foods weren't just about sustenance. They were codes of survival, written in hunger and holiness. You pause before a cracked tablet from Mesopotamia, its cuneiform etchings telling the story of a harvest sacrificed to the gods. To modernize, it's myth, but to those people it was truth, a way of giving meaning to unpredictable nature. They couldn't control the floods or the droughts, but they could control themselves. Scholars still argue whether food taboos emerged from fear, reverence, or clever governance. You sense it was all three. When chaos threatened, ritual created order. A forbidden meal wasn't just a restriction, it was reassurance. You wander to another display, a golden goblet from Egypt, engraved with lotus patterns. Once only priests could drink from it. The idea of separation, pure and impure, divine and human, runs through history like a secret river. Every culture, you realize, needs boundaries. They remind people that eating is not just physical, but spiritual. The simple act of lifting food to your lips is a negotiation between body and belief. You can almost hear the priests whispering across time, "Respect what sustains you." The air feels heavy with incense as your mind drifts to India, to temple courtyards where food is still offered to gods before humans may taste it. The lesson is subtle, yet timeless. Gratitude must come before consumption. Whether one prays to Shiva, Yahweh, Zeus, or no one at all, the instinct remains to acknowledge that life itself is borrowed, not owned. Those ancient prohibitions, you realized, were ways to remind people of humility. A forbidden food wasn't punishment, it was a pause for reflection. Further down the hall, a Roman mosaic catches your eye. Diners reclining, servants pouring wine. You recall how emperors once controlled access to grain, turning hunger into politics. Even today, you see echoes. Food deserts, trade wars, luxury branding. The instruments have changed, but the melody is the same. Scholars still argue whether civilization advanced because of food or in spite of it. But as you gaze at the mosaic, you feel the truth. Control the meal, control the world. You turn and see a faded fresco from ancient China, a banquet scene shimmering in pale blues and reds. Beside it, a small inscription describes dietary balance, yin and yang, harmony through taste. The ancient Chinese understood something we often forget. Moderation is the foundation of peace. When people respected boundaries, seasonal, spiritual, or biological, they lived longer, healthier lives. Forbidden foods weren't always moral tests. Sometimes they were early forms of science. What began as sacred precaution evolved into wisdom still taught in kitchens today. Odd details flit through your mind. The Celtic harvest sacrifices, the Hebrew kosher laws, the fasts of Greek philosophers. Each one reflects a culture's dialogue with nature and mortality. By drawing lines around what could be eaten, societies learned restraint, unity, and reverence. You realize now that the real power of the forbidden lies not in the food itself, but in the discipline it teaches. And then comes the quiet epiphany. You're part of that story too. Every choice you make at your table, every ingredient you accept or reject, carries echoes of ancient rules. When you skip meat, choose organic, or say grace before dinner, you're reenacting millennia of belief. The forbidden has simply evolved into the mindful. You close your eyes and imagine all those civilizations layered like sediment. Egypt, Greece, India, Rome, China, Babylon. Each leaving flavors, fears, and faiths in the great recipe of humanity. What we call culture today began in the kitchen. What we call morality was once a menu. As you move toward the exit, the hum of history seems to soften. You pass one last display. An unassuming clay bowl, cracked but intact. A note beside it reads, "Used for the first offering of grain. Do not touch." You smile. Even now, the instinct to preserve, to protect, survives. Maybe that's the final lesson. Every generation inherits a forbidden fruit, not to eat it, but to remember why it mattered. You step outside into the night air. The city hums, alive with light and motion. Somewhere, people are eating, laughing, breaking bread without thought. And yet, if they could listen closely, they'd hear it too. The ancient whisper beneath every bite. Respect what feeds you. Question what tempts you. And never forget that the simplest meal carries the weight of 1,000 years.
You take a slow breath and look up at the night sky. The stars shimmer softly, like scattered grains of salt across a dark tablecloth. Somewhere, far below them, the rivers still run, the fields still grow, and the old taboos linger in quiet corners of our kitchens. Maybe it's not about what we're forbidden to eat, but what we choose to remember. Every forbidden food was once a story, a warning, a prayer, a promise between people and the earth. You imagine ancient fires flickering in the distance, villagers sharing modest meals, priests lifting sacred cups, farmers saving the first sheaf for unseen gods. Each one an echo of the same truth. You can't separate humanity from what it eats. The rules may fade, but the reverence should not. Your breathing slows. The thought settles over you like a soft blanket. These ancient boundaries weren't prisons, they were poetry. They gave meaning to hunger, rhythm to survival, and humility to abundance. The hum of a fan nearby fills the room, blending with the faint sounds of your own heartbeat. History quiets itself to a murmur. The past folds gently into the present. Close your eyes now. The stories of forbidden foods have fed your imagination, and through them you've wandered across empires, temples, and kitchens older than memory. Let them rest there, like embers glowing faintly in the dark. End of script. Sweet dreams.